Welcome to this meeting in our Forum for Conscious Research. My name is Johan Storm and I'm leading this forum, and today and tomorrow we'll have guest lectures by two eminent researchers who will present some unusual ideas regarding where in the brain consciousness arises. They are both challenging the idea that consciousness arises in the cerebral cortex. Today's lecture is given by Professor Mark Solms from South Africa, Cape Town. And tomorrow we'll hear from Professor Björn Merker from Kristianstad in Sweden. Both these talks are streamed and recorded and are posted on our website, and you see the address up here. After each talk, there will be questions and discussion for about 45 minutes. But before I start, I would like to remind the audience that how we define consciousness in our field. Consciousness is simply the experience of any kind, seeing, hearing, feeling, thinking, and so on. And this phenomenon is regarded as a deep mystery that is still not understood by science. A key question, of course, is where in the brain is consciousness located. And most research in our field would answer the cerebral cortex is the main site, but the brain stem is needed to activate the cortex and make us awake. And you can see the same here in this authoritative book by Christoph Koch, that the neural correlates of consciousness are, in his view, regarded to be mostly in the cortex and thalamus. And if you look at Google, we find that neuroscientists believe that in humans and mammals, the cerebral cortex is the seat of consciousness. And among the 27 prominent scientists who have been talking in our forum before, the large majority of them, that here are marked in red, have focused their search for the site of consciousness mainly on the cortex. Prominent exceptions are Jaak Panksepp, that you see here, was here in 2014. Björn Merker, of course, he will talk tomorrow and was here already in 2018. And also Rodolfo Linas, who regards himself as less of a cortical chauvinist, as he says. This overwhelming focus on the cerebral cortex was also reflected in a recent review article that we published in May this year. And here we compare 5 prominent theories of consciousness, but all of them focus on the cortex, and none on the deeper, phylogenetically older parts of the brain. So although I've personally always been interested in these older parts, I unfortunately never had the capacity to focus on them in my own research, except on some cellular activation mechanisms that we have worked on. Therefore, it's very welcome that Mark and Björn now can fill these gaps and share their deep knowledge in this field and their original perspectives. This has been missing so far in our forum. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Solms from Cape Town. He's director of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town, and also an honorary lecturer in neurosurgery at the St. Bartholomew's and Royal Hospital in London, School of Medicine, and an honorary fellow of the American College of Psychiatrists, and a member of the British, American, and South African Psychoanalytic Associations and Societies. He has published 350 scientific papers and 8 books. And is also an editor and translator of the revised edition of the complete psychological works of Sigmund Freud, which is in 24 volumes. So I can mention only a few additional points from his impressive CV. Mark studied psychology at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa, where he obtained a bachelor in 1984, followed by an honors degree and a master's degree in 1997 and a PhD in 1992. He then went to London and working both on research in University College and clinically at the Royal London Hospital, and was also then trained in psychoanalysis. So in 2000, he founded the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society and the corresponding journal, and became director of several neuropsychoanalysis institutions, both in London, New York, and Cape Town. So he's now also president of the South African Psychoanalytic Association and research chair on the International Psychoanalytical Association. So I can only mention a few of these many eminent research articles, and would like to highlight these. First, dreaming and REM sleep are controlled by different brain mechanisms in 2000. The id knows more than the ego admits with Jaak Panksepp in 2012. How and why consciousness arises, some considerations from physics and physiology with Carl Fristen, and as a follow-up, the hard problem consciousness and the free energy principle, which I think you will hear more about today. And in the neurobiological underpinnings of the psychoanalytic theory and therapy. And these are 5 of his books, and we in particular recommend the Hidden Spring, that you see here from 2021, which is really a marvelous book. So with this, it's a pleasure for me to give the floor to you, Mark, and we are looking very much forward to a talk.
And I'll just make sure I've got the laser pointer. Okay. Thank you very much. I must just correct one thing that Johan Storm said. Because I'm here, and I'm no longer the chair of the research committee of the IPA, my successor is a Norwegian, so I must, her name is Siri Gullestad, so I must correct that, otherwise the news will get back to her that I have not relinquished my position. I'm very glad to see so many young faces, because what I'm going to talk to you about, once you've established a career studying cortical mechanisms of consciousness, it's quite hard to go back and say, well, for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe I've been looking in the wrong place. So hopefully I can set you on a different path right from the beginning. But seriously, I know that what I'm going to say is not what one commonly hears, and so of course I'm having to face strong resistances. I ask you just to listen to what I say with an open mind and see if I'm able to persuade you. I'm also, I must say, delighted that this is a coupling of my lecture today with Bjorn Merkers tomorrow. I have always been terribly impressed by his work, and he had a big influence on me, as you'll see. So, here we go. Here we have the functional mechanisms of visual perception from the macaque cortex here, and here it is as an information flow diagram. And this is the model example we have of the neural correlates of consciousness. We've always focused on vision, not least because so much of the cortex is given to visual processing. We understand it so very well, but also if you observe your conscious experience right now, it's dominated by vision. I think most people, when they think of consciousness, they speak of the lights going on, and that's because it's visual. And I'm going to argue today that this was an unfortunate place to start. It was unfortunate that we used vision as our model example of consciousness, because it led us down all sorts of rabbit holes that it's now very hard to extract ourselves from. Now, while I have this slide on the screen, let me remind you of the famous story concocted by the philosopher Frank Jackson, which is known as the knowledge argument. I'm sure most of you have heard this argument. I'm going to give it to you in a simplified form. In my version of the story, Mary, the visual neuroscientist, who knows everything there is to know about the mechanisms of vision and the mechanisms of visual consciousness, this sort of stuff that's on the screen, she knows all of that, but in my version of the story, she's blind. Okay, in the fuller version, it's more complicated and gruesome than that. But let's just say, Mary, although she knows all of this, all of the functional mechanisms that causally account for visual physiology, visual psychology, she's learnt it all, even though she has never seen anything. Then one day, thanks be to God, the gift of sight is bestowed upon her, and now for the first time, Mary sees. For the first time, Mary has visual experience. And according to the story of Frank Jackson, at this moment, Mary learns something utterly new about vision. So even though she knew all of this about the functional mechanisms, she had a mechanistic, physicalist, causal account of everything that there is to know about the physics and psychophysiology and physiology of vision, still nothing of this had prepared her for what it is like to see. The experience of seeing, the phenomenal qualitative stuff of visual experience was not predicted by or accounted for, explained by all of this. And so Frank Jackson's argument goes, this mechanistic, causal, functionalist account of vision, or even indeed any physicalist account of vision, doesn't contain within it the major stuff of visual consciousness. The consciousness seems to reside in some other realm. It doesn't arise from, it isn't accounted for, it isn't even necessary for all of this visual information processing to include experience. And indeed that is so. Those of you who are watching this online, there is a camera that is seeing me, that is processing all of this, or at least seeing my slides, processing all of it, transmitting all of this visual information, which is being received by your monitors, and we have to assume that your monitor and all of the connections between me and it don't entail any conscious visual experience. So this makes visual experience into something rather spooky, and there we have what later becomes known as the hard problem of consciousness. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? And that, of course, is a pithy formulation of the hard problem by David Chalmers himself. Chalmers wasn't the first to be perplexed by how do we insert phenomenal, qualitative, subjective experience into the fabric of mechanistic physical science. He was building on many generations of philosophers before him, not least of them being Tom Nagel. Tom Nagel would put, on the basis of his famous 1974 paper on what is it like to be a bat, he would put the problem like this. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? So as you've been prepared already by the title of my presentation and by my opening remarks, I'm going to argue that the reason why people like Nagel and Chalmers and indeed Frank Jackson are so perplexed by why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, and indeed how and why does this information processing give rise to the actual experience of conscious being, that the reason they're so perplexed is because they've been focusing on the cortex. I said that the model example that we've been using in cognitive neuroscience, in consciousness studies generally, is visual consciousness, the idea being perhaps epitomized by Francis Crick and Koch, that if we can find the neural correlate of visual consciousness, then we can generalize from that to all of consciousness. And as I've said to you already, I think that was an unfortunate place to start. I think we should rather have started in the brainstem. Now, it's not entirely unreasonable that we started with the cortex. It's perfectly obvious why we started with the cortex. We know that, taking again the example of vision, that the photosensitive cells in your retina, they transmit nerve impulses from the transduction of the light waves into nerve impulses. They convey those nerve impulses via the lateral geniculate body over there, and then to visual cortex. And something analogous happens with all of our sensory modalities. Each one of the special senses, visual, auditory, somatosensory, gustatory, and olfactory, project information from their various sensory epithelia to a dedicated zone in the cortex. So we can follow that path. We can see the visual information goes directly from those sensory end organs to the cortex. That information also goes elsewhere, but why we focus particularly on the fact that it goes to the cortex is that if you damage the part of cortex in question, generally known as projection cortex, because it's where the sensory organs project their information, if you damage the projection cortex, say in our model example case, the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, then you lose visual experience. If it's damaged on the left occipital lobe, you lose visual experience on the right, and vice versa. If you damage both primary occipital cortices, then you are blind. In other words, you lose visual consciousness. And the same applies to the other modalities. And this is why I'm saying it's perfectly reasonable that we started there. If I can just pause here for a moment to make the obvious point. I said to you, if you observe your experience right now, you will notice it's dominated by vision. But if you dwell on the matter a little bit longer, you'll notice it's not only visual, of course, you're hearing me. So there's visual experience, there's auditory experience, and you feel yourself sitting in your seat. There's somatosensory experience, and if you're unfortunate enough, you might be smelling something, and if you really want to annoy your neighbor, you might even taste something. But the point is that that's all that there is. Your consciousness is made up of these 5 ingredients. These are the raw materials of consciousness. And so again, it's not unreasonable that the view has prevailed for such a very long time that the cortex is, as was quoted in Johann Sturm's opening extract from, I think it was Wikipedia, that it is the seat of consciousness. This is where consciousness is generated in the brain. If we're looking for a neural correlate of consciousness, we should seek to find it in the cortex. So as I say, it's not unreasonable. Now, here starts the problems with this not unreasonable approach. I've chosen this paper, which is a review article written by John Kihlström in the late 1990s. I've chosen this one as an example of many other such papers that I could have used for my purposes. Namely papers which review the vast experimental literature that accumulated over the last decades of the last century, demonstrating that, in fact, cortical perceptual processes are not intrinsically conscious, that you can see, hear, touch, taste, smell, etc., all of it unconsciously. And I insist that not only, of course, can we do that, we know that because, as I said to you, the sensory end organs don't only send information to the cortex, they send information to all sorts of other parts of the brain where we believe correctly that it is processed unconsciously. But I'm going to illustrate with one example in a moment that the same applies to the cortex. And this is why I chose this article. It's because of the title is so wonderfully demonstrative of what it is that I'm trying to say to you, that we can perceive without awareness of what we perceive, We can learn without awareness of what we learn. In other words, perception and cognition is not intrinsically conscious. Perception and cognition is not intrinsically conscious. And this applies equally to cortical perception and cognition. And I said I'll give you just one example. Here's the example. And remember, there are myriad studies like this, but I want to illustrate it with this example because it shows that this statement that gives this paper its title applies not only to subcortical perceptual and cognitive mechanisms, but to cortical ones too. In this particular study, research participants look into a tachistoscope where visual information is presented extremely briefly, so briefly that the participant sees nothing at all. Not only they don't see the content of what is flashed, they see nothing at all. In other words, they don't even realize that anything is being flashed. This is the level below which the information is presented to the research participants when they're unable to report seeing anything at all. What is presented to them is two faces. Face A, two male faces. Face A, under which is written the word rapist. And then face B, under which is written the word philanthropist. After these faces have been presented to the research participants, they are then shown supraliminally these same two faces, and they are asked to choose which one of these two gentlemen they prefer. And the participants say, I have no preference, I have never met these people before. And they are then told this is a forced choice paradigm, they have to select one. They have to choose on the basis of just of intuition or gut feel or guessing or whatever you want to call it, which one they prefer, and way above chance, they choose face B. Now, we know why they've chosen face B. It's because face B is a philanthropist, and face A is a rapist, and we know that this information is being conveyed to them. But we also know that this information was not registered consciously. In other words, they have perceived this information, and they have learnt on the basis of that perceptual experience, but the perceptual experience was entirely unconscious, and the learning was entirely unconscious. Why this is important, why I'm using this example, is because face recognition is a cortical function. Not less so, in fact more so, reading with comprehension is a cortical function. It's a uniquely human cortical function. So even these extremely high-level cognitive and perceptual processes, which are unequivocally cortical, some of which are even uniquely human, like reading with comprehension, these visual, perceptual, and cognitive processes can go on without consciousness at all. So this, I would say, makes reasonable the question, why is the performance of these functions ever accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all of this information processing go on in the dark? And I'm saying, well, that's such a reasonable question, only because they're looking at a function which is not an intrinsically conscious function. Vision is not intrinsically conscious. Perception is not intrinsically conscious. Cognition is not intrinsically conscious. Cortical functions are not intrinsically conscious. So it's no surprise that you can make statements like this. It's no surprise that Mary, the visual neuroscientist, can know everything that there is to know about things like this, about the mechanisms of cortical visual processing, and that this doesn't prepare her for, predict, or explain why these experiences are conscious. It's because they are not necessarily conscious. They do not have to be conscious. I'm not saying that they're never conscious. Of course they are. Go back again to your experience here and now. Of course they are. Of course they can be. And frankly, I am very grateful that they are. I wouldn't like to forfeit my cortex. But my point, I want to be clear, is that they are not intrinsically conscious. They're not necessarily conscious. Even at the highest levels, the example that I've given you about face recognition and reading with comprehension, even at those highest levels, consciousness does not necessarily attach to cortical, perceptual, and cognitive functions. This is why I'm saying we're looking in the wrong place. So where should we be looking instead? Well, the obvious place to look is to look to that part of the brainstem, the intrinsic function of which is to generate consciousness, known as the reticular activating system. This is the function of this part of the brain. It activates the cortex and renders it conscious. If you have damage in the reticular activating system, you fall into a coma. If you disconnect, as Maruzzi and Magoon did, if you disconnect, you sever the ascending fibers from the reticular activating system, projecting to the cortical mantle, then the cortical mantle becomes unconscious. In other words, the consciousness of cortical information processing is reliant upon or contingent upon activation by the reticular activating system. Unless the reticular activating system modulates cortical message passing, cortical information processing, that information processing goes on in the dark, free of any inner field. That's intrinsic, cortex alone processing of the perceptual information. When the cortex processes perceptual information by itself, as it does, by the way, in coma and when you're asleep, and we've studied this extensively, it doesn't go very far, but it's there, it's registered. The cortex has its own intrinsic slow waves, and it registers this information, but none of it is conscious. What renders it conscious is the arousal, the activation, the modulation from the reticular activating system. Now, if we've known that since 1949, as we have, then why did we not look there for the neural correlate of consciousness or the neural basis of consciousness? Actually, before I answer that question, let me just say, let me zoom forwards from 1949 to 2016 and say that Fisher and colleagues did a very good study surveying all of the not all of them, but all of those that they could find, imaging studies of brainstem stroke in order to ascertain what is the smallest region of the human brain which, when lesioned, will lead to coma. And they identified a 2 cubic millimeters square, 2 cubic millimeters, size of a match head in the parabrachial complex of the human brainstem, and they called this the coma-specific region. That's not to say that only when you have damage in the parabrachial complex do you have coma. In fact, you can have damage anywhere in the reticular activating system and have coma. But the smallest lesion necessary to produce coma is in the parabrachial complex, only 2 cubic millimeters in extent. This is the most concentrated consciousness-producing tissue that there is, clearly. So I ask you again, why did we not look here? Is this not the obvious place to look? And I'll tell you why we didn't. It's because when Maruzzi and Magoon discovered this very surprising finding, they did not expect to find in the poor cats that they were studying, that when they lesioned the reticular activating system, which at that point wasn't even called that, when they lesion the reticular formation, which is what they actually lesioned, that the cats would fall into coma. They assumed, as did everybody before them, and unfortunately, as does most people since them, they assumed that consciousness flows in from the outside with perceptual information. But what their studies showed was that, no, it's not the case. In fact, the consciousness is generated endogenously from within the innermost core of the brain, that the consciousness is a property of the brain from its innermost ancient primitive brainstem interior, and this is where the consciousness comes from. Because they were taught that, because they believed that, and because they continue to believe that even after they observed this striking finding which seems to suggest the exact opposite, they fudged it. They had to find some way of conceptualizing what they had seen which was able to preserve the cortical theory of consciousness. In other words, the theory that consciousness is intrinsic to cortex. And how they did that was by dividing consciousness into 2 aspects. The one being called its level, which is where my pointer is pointing. This they attributed to the reticular activating system. And the other they called its contents. Now the contents, of course, are the important part. The level is just a quantity. It's just a background level of wakefulness. Obviously, you have to be awake in order to be able to have conscious experience. So you have to be conscious in order to have consciousness. the being of consciousness, in other words, this thing that they call the level or the wakefulness, the quantitative dimension of consciousness, is provided by the reticular activating system. It is a prerequisite for conscious experience to occur, but conscious experience, in other words, the contents, the qualities, the qualia, the actual experiential stuff that makes up the thing that we call consciousness, this, they said, is provided by the cortex. Yes, please. If he's going to ask a question, we'll need a mic because we... but we have people online. Okay, we'll do it.
Just one simple question.
Okay.
Does consciousness, do you need electricity to have consciousness?
So the question for those of you who are online was, do you need to have a consciousness like an electricity supply? This is the question that he's asking, and that's a wonderful question because it sets up exactly what I was about to say next, which is that the way in which Magoon and Maruzzi understood what the reticular activating system is doing was exactly on the analogy of it's an electricity supply, a power supply. And in fact, that exact image has been used. So let me spell it out for you, because I think it illustrates very well what the problem is. When they say that the reticular activating system enables consciousness or is a prerequisite for consciousness, but it is not consciousness itself, they use the analogy of plugging a television set into an electrical power source at the wall. So, of course, you can't watch television or generate televisual images and programming unless you have first plugged in the set at the wall and switched it on. This is a necessary prerequisite, an enabler of the television set to do its televisual thing. But it would be absurd on this basis to say that really television is generated by the power supply at the wall. It's exactly that is the argument. So thank you for that. So this is the picture that dominates our field. I don't know whether you've been taught this. Certainly I was taught it time and time again, and I hear it being taught time and time again, and I hear people responding to what I say without properly understanding or listening or reading in any detail. Yeah, we've always known that. Of course, that's a necessary prerequisite for consciousness, but that's not consciousness itself. And it's this that I'm going to now present you with a sequence of illustrative examples of the sorts of evidence that has accumulated over the last several decades, the last few decades, that shows that this is a wrong-headed picture, that this is simply not true. It is not true that the contents and qualities of consciousness are the exclusive preserve of the cortex, and that what the brainstem provides is only a power supply, something without content and without quality, a mere level, a quantitative level measured by, say, the Glasgow Coma scale, on a 15 sort of point level of consciousness. But the really interesting stuff about consciousness is its contents and its qualities, and this, we say, is the exclusive preserve of the cortex, and I'm going to show you that that is what is wrong. So the way in which this striking finding, which I think should have brought the whole cortical fallacy crumbling down, the reason it didn't is because of this view, this theory, that actually the brainstem is not providing the actual stuff of consciousness, just this prerequisite power supply. That is what I'm going to show you is not correct. So please understand, I'm going to give you illustrative examples. I'm not going to give you the full gamut of all the evidence that is accumulated, because of course that's not possible in the time available to us. But these are, they cover the types of evidence that we have. Now I'll start with a slide that I read a paper by Bjorn Merker, and this slide was in that paper. It is the MRI scan of a child who was born without cortex. This is a condition known as hydranencephaly. So this is a wonderful experimental, an experiment of nature, but a wonderful opportunity for us to test predictions arising from the cortical theory of consciousness. A child who is born with no cortex should have no consciousness. I suppose the extreme view would be that she should be in a coma. But on the view that is expounded by Maruzzi and Magoon, and everybody following in their footsteps, namely that she should have a power supply, she should have some sort of level of wakefulness without any content, without any phenomenal qualitative feel. On this view, then this child should be in what we call, or what we used to call, a vegetative state. We don't use the term, or some of us do, but it's sort of fallen out of favor because it's a little bit derogatory to say the child will be a vegetable. So what we say nowadays for that same clinical condition, we call it non-responsive wakefulness. In other words, the child should have a sleep-wake cycle. She should wake up in this kind of contentless level of the power supply being booted up. But since there's no television set there to do anything with this power supply, there will be no content and no quality. And that's the non-responsive part, because she just wakes up and goes to sleep, wakes up and goes to sleep. This is what would be predicted by that theory. And there is such a condition called non-responsive wakefulness. And that's because the sleep-wake cycle is an autonomic reflex. It just carries on running. So that's what you would expect. Remember, I asked you at the beginning, please, all I ask of you is have an open mind. Okay? And I'm saying, well, here surely is a test case par excellence. Here is somebody with no cortex. So if she has no cortex, she must have no contents and no qualities to her experience. She should be a non-responsive, blank, wakeful zombie. And here we see that that's not the case. What's happened to my pointer? How odd. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here's a girl with absolutely no cortex. As you can see, she's awake. She wakes up in the morning and she goes to sleep at night. As it happens, in fact, this child, as frequently these children do, has seizures, absence seizures, where she loses consciousness and then regains consciousness. Even her parents can see, now she's here, now she's gone. But much more interesting than that is the question of non-responsiveness. Her baby brother is placed in her lap, and you see how she responds. Please note the word, responds, to her baby brother being placed in her lap. She goes, ah! She likes it. She likes it. That is, by the way, a quality, a feel, a content. If you take her brother away, she goes, and she arches her back. She gets annoyed. If you clap your hands, she startles. She gets a fright. If you tickle her, she giggles. If you pinch her, she squawks, etc. All these basic emotional responses that you would expect to the stimuli of the kind that I'm speaking of, all of these responses are present in this child who, on the theory of the level versus the contents of consciousness, on the theory that the contents are provided by the cortex and not by the brainstem. On this theory, all of those predictions are disconfirmed by just this one observation. The child has consciousness, and that consciousness does have a qualitative feel and a content. That qualitative feel and content is affective. When I said to you earlier, can you not see that all of your consciousness is made up of these 5 raw ingredients? I left out this other ingredient called affect. It's remarkable how that's overlooked, because certainly in my life, that's the most important part of my consciousness. Everything else that I'm doing is sort of trying to get that part into kilter. Now, this child is not unique. I've showed this slide because this is the one that I saw in Bjorn's paper, and it was an eye-opener to me. But she's not unique. Bjorn before Bjorn, there was David Schumann. He was the first to say, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're saying these children should be vegetative, so we treat them as vegetative, and they end up very, very disabled. Very unresponsive. Just like children in an orphanage, you have absolutely no nursing, no emotional human contact. You know about these terrible things that happened decades ago. These children ended up being non-responsive because nobody was interacting with them. And Schumann was the first to say, well, let's interact with them and see what happens. And after Schumann, Bjorn studied these kids in enormous detail. And perhaps he'll tell us more about that tomorrow. I don't know. But here's another child. This is a photograph of another child that Bjorn studied. And he told me today that she died in July this year. I was very sorry to hear that. I didn't know that. But again, look at her. Can you really tell me this is a non-responsive child? Can you really tell me there's nobody at home, that there's no sentient being here? She is, like all of these children, emotionally responsive. Of course, these children are blind and deaf and lack all of the cortical qualia that I enumerated earlier. But they are not without phenomenal feel. They are not without conscious content and quality. Now you might well be wondering, how on earth is that possible? How can she respond to her baby brother being placed on her lap if she's anesthetic and blind and deaf and so on? And that's because, as I said to you earlier, all of our sensory end organs, here we use the example of the eye, that they send information not only via the thalamus to the cortex, but they also send information to subcortical structures. And I'm drawing attention here to the fact that visual and, in fact, multimodal special sensory information is sent to the superior colliculi. So the brainstem is receiving visual, tactile, auditory, etc. information, but it's processing it unconsciously. This part of the brainstem, the superior colliculi, are directly adjacent to another structure known as the periaqueductal gray, about which I'll have more to say later. But let me just say for now that although the visual and other special sensory information that's being projected there is not conscious, the feeling, the emotional response to that information is certainly conscious. It's felt. The child just doesn't know why it feels what it feels. Exactly like the research participants who looked at those two faces in the tachistoscope. They don't know they've seen anything. In fact, they have not consciously seen anything, just like this child, but they have a gut feeling. I don't like that guy. I prefer this one. Okay? So she has a gut feeling. Something nice is happening. Her baby brother's on her lap, but she doesn't know that's what's on her lap. She doesn't know that's why she's happy. But she responds in that particular way that we do when we have that warm, fuzzy experience of a little baby placed in our laps. I say again, it's not just one experience of one child. This is typical, and it's typical also of the range of basic emotional responses. There's a range of basic emotional responses seen, and those responses are appropriate to the context. So these children are conscious, they have qualitative feeling, and this is a content, these are qualia, and what is more, and I'm going to pause here because this is a really important point, and what is more, these seem to be the foundational qualia. These seem to be the most basic form of conscious content and quality. Why do I say that? Because nobody disagrees that cortical consciousness is contingent upon brainstem arousal. But they're saying, well, that's just a power supply. Now I'm saying to you, or we're saying to you, because I'm not the only one, thank God, who's saying this, but there's only a small number of us. But what I'm saying to you is that this prerequisite, this necessary enabling precondition for the cortex to be conscious is that you have to have feeling. You have to have affect. At the so-called quantitative level has a qualitative feel, a qualitative content called affect, and that is the foundational form of consciousness. So it's not just, we have a sixth sense. This is not just a sixth perceptual modality. It's not a perceptual modality at all. It is the grounding basis of all consciousness. First, we feel. I suddenly have a biblical phrase coming to mind. In the beginning was the feeling. Okay. Now, many colleagues, and I'm sad to say many colleagues, when people like Bjorn and myself and our dear colleague Jaak Panksepp, now no longer alive, present this sort of information, to our cognitive neuroscientific colleagues, they say, well, how do you know that that girl really is conscious? I want to show her to you again. How do you know? By the way, the vast majority of these colleagues have never interacted with such children. But they say on the basis of radical philosophical skepticism, how do you know? Well, how do you know that your dog is conscious? How do you know your pre-verbal baby is conscious? How do you know, etc.? How do I know that any of you are conscious? You can't know for sure that any other creature other than yourself is conscious, because here we have the philosophical problem of other minds. Consciousness is a subjective state. You can only ever observe empirically your own. But the criterion that these colleagues use is reportability. They say this is the only empirical criterion that we can use. If you can't report conscious states, then how do you know they're there? So, for example, those people looking at the tachistoscope, it's only when they report no conscious experience we say, okay, now they're not experiencing anymore. When they say, yes, now I see something, not sure what it is, it's on the basis of their reporting. How else can you know? So this is the problem with these children. They can't report their conscious states. And so we can adopt, I don't think reportability, by the way, is any great shakes. I think it's a rather silly criterion for determining whether or not, when you go onto the internet and it says to you, are you a robot? You don't just report no. You have to perform some sort of task which shows you're not a robot. But let's leave that aside. My point is it's very easy for a robot to report that it's conscious when it's not. Reportability is no big deal. But, of course, they're right, my colleagues are right when they say, well, how do you know? These children don't say they're conscious. These might be reflexes. These might be instinctual behavioral responses, and behind that there's no body home. There's no actual experience. It just looks like an emotional response. Maybe it isn't one. Now, we do have to take that seriously. Although, remember, as I said, we have to take it seriously that the same might apply to all of us. All of you, rather, not me. I know that I'm conscious. But the same might apply to your dogs and your cats and your pre-verbal infants and whatnot. But we do need to take it seriously. How do we get around this? Well, we're not philosophers, who need truth and absolute proof and so on. It doesn't exist in science. We mustn't hold a higher bar up for the scientific study of consciousness than for the scientific study of anything else. What do? Well, we have to approach this with methodological ingenuity. We have to say, okay, well, here's one method. It's called the lesion method. When you remove a piece of brain that is supposed to perform a certain function, and if the function is not lost, then you have to say, well, then that part of the brain can't be performing that function. That's one method. And by the way, when I say remove, of course, nobody removes these children's cortex, but we do it with other mammals. It's been done, thankfully not by me, but it's been done endless numbers of times, that you remove in neonatal mammals, in other words, newborn mammals, you remove their cortex, and they behave exactly like these children do. They show full range of emotional responses. They get fear, they get anger, they get nurturant, they copulate, they raise their children to maturity, not perfectly, but they do, they're pups. They play, they hang from bars, etc. They do all sorts of emotional things with absolutely no cortex. So how do we know? We use other methods. We use other methods which get around the problem of not having any cortex and therefore not being able to report. So here is again, remember these are illustrative examples. Here's one example of one study. But there are many, many, many other studies like this. This is a patient in whom an electrode is placed into the reticular activating system and it is stimulated electrically. Now, if the reticular activating system, in this patient's case, it's the substantia nigra, if the reticular activating system is stimulated and all that it provides is a power supply, then what might you expect? Remember, we're doing science. You make predictions. You say, well, consciousness, the level might increase or the level might decrease. But it can only be something to do with the level. It can't change the content. It can't change the quality. In other words, if you cut the electrical power supply cord or you stimulate the electrical power supply cord going to your television set, you might expect, the thing to go all fuzzy, for it to lose its contents and programs. Or you might expect it to become very bright or very dim or something like that, but you won't expect the content, the programming to change. But that is exactly what happens, the opposite of what's predicted by the cortical theory. So on the alternative theory, the idea that in those children the brainstem is producing the affect, you can test that with this method, and you can say, well, if you stimulate the brainstem and the reticular activating structures within the brainstem, then the prediction would be you would produce affective responses. Not so. Remember that open mind I'm asking you for. Not so. I mean, that's what you would predict. And if that's what you find, well, then there's a problem with the alternative theory. And that is what you find. So this particular case is a woman with Parkinson's disease, 65 years old, never had any psychiatric history, and in particular never had any clinical depression. For the treatment of her Parkinson's disease, the surgeon inserted an electrode which was meant to stimulate here in the subthalamic nucleus, which is not part of the reticular activating system, but the electrode went a few millimeters more deeply than it should have, and it stimulated the substantia nigra. And within 5 seconds, the patient starts to cry, verbally communicates feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness, and hopelessness. She says, I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything. When asked why she's crying and is she feeling pain, she says, no, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless, always feeling worthless. When asked why she was sad, she replied, I'm tired. I'm crying over myself, of course. I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you? The depression, that is what this was. I mean, what else can you call that but depression? Suicidal depression. Stimulated 5 seconds after the electrode was switched on in a patient who's never experienced anything like this in her life before. When the electrode is switched off, about 90 seconds later, the depression disappears. This patient very kindly and courageously, generously, agreed to allow the surgeon to switch the stimulator on again. And again, it produced the same response. He then moved it either to the subthalamic nucleus, because you've got a number of nodes on the electrode, so he could shift which node is being switched on, and without the patient knowing whether the node that was active was in the subthalamic nucleus or in the reticular activating system. Each time, with her being blind to where the stimulation was, whenever the brainstem structure, the reticulate structure was activated, she fell back into this suicidal depression. Now, I told you this is one case. I'm giving you illustrative examples. What I can tell you is that if you stimulate, whenever we have medical opportunity to do so, if you stimulate within the reticulate brainstem, you produce the most intense and widest range of affective responses that you can get from stimulating anywhere in the brain. And this applies particularly to the periaqueductal gray, that structure that I showed you earlier that lies right next to the superior colliculi, where all this unconscious information is going in from the perceptual periphery. The periaqueductal gray stimulating there produces the most intense and the greatest variety of affective responses that you can get anywhere in the brain. Stimulate cortex, you don't get affective responses. You might get affective thoughts or affective memories, but nothing like this. So there's another method getting around the problem of these children without cortex not being able to report their inner states. Here's another method. Positron emission tomography of people who have been induced into intense affective states. If you scan their brains while they're in those intense affective states, you should be able to see where the arousal is, where the activation is, which part of the brain is generating this state. And so you have an opportunity to see, is it cortex or is it brainstem? And Damasio here's again just one study. Damasio did this Intense sadness, the activation is in the brainstem. Intense anger, the activation is in the brainstem. Intense happiness, it's in the brainstem, and also these ascending pathways. This is the dopaminergic pathway ascending from the ventral tegmental area here. And in intense fear, again, these are subcortical sites of activation. This is what you would expect if the affect is actually being generated there. And it's not what you would expect if it was being generated in cortex. I'll give you one last method, which is pharmacological manipulation. And I see I really have to hurry up with my I'm speaking for too long. Have I? Great, thank you. Okay, so I won't rush too much. So here's another method. These are the neuromodulators that are sourced in the nuclei of the reticular activating system. If these neuromodulators were just a power supply, they were just mediating some sort of arousal function, then again you would expect maybe anesthetists would be interested in manipulating the levels of these brain chemicals, but no, it's not anesthetists that manipulate these chemicals. It is psychiatrists, doctors for feelings, people who treat emotional disorders. As is well known, SSRIs, which increase the availability of serotonin, which is sourced in the reticular activating system. The cell bodies of the serotonergic systems of the brain are in the reticular activating system. This is used for the treatment of depression. The blocking of dopamine, sourced in the ventral tegmental area, again, part of the reticular activating system, is used in the treatment of psychosis. And the same applies to noradrenaline, again, a neuromodulator, the source cells of which are located in the reticular activating system. This is manipulated for the treatment of anxiety. These are not levels of consciousness. These are qualities of consciousness. These are contents of consciousness, and these qualities and contents are affective. So, to pull together, again, everything that I've been saying, I'm going to repeat something I've said before, which is that it seems that the prerequisite form of consciousness, the thing that is necessary for any other form of consciousness, I'm not saying the whole of consciousness, I'm saying the necessary prerequisite, the elemental foundational form of consciousness is generated in the brainstem, the periaqueductal gray and the reticular activating system. Therefore, the idea that the qualities and contents of consciousness are in exclusively cortical preserve is wrong. And what is more, don't forget that cortical consciousness only comes about when the cortex is modulated by these brainstem structures. If I may put it rather poetically, we have to feel our way into our cortical mantle. We have to feel our way into our otherwise unconscious perceptual and cognitive cortical processes. Here's a statement by, you heard I am for my sins a psychoanalyst. Here's a statement by Sigmund Freud, the discoverer of the unconscious, the person who pointed out 100 years before Kihlstrom and my cognitive neuroscientific colleagues of my own generation, 100 years before that, Sigmund Freud was saying, cognition is not essentially conscious. In fact, most cognition is unconscious, and everyone was horrified and saying, oh, duh, don't you understand? Mind means consciousness. How can you say that they're unconscious mental functions? Even Freud, the one who said that much of, indeed most of our cognition and perception goes on unconsciously, he said this: it's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. So even Freud recognized that when it comes to affect, we're talking about something which is essentially conscious. Perception is not. Cognition is not. It can go on in the dark. But can you have a feeling without feeling it? I've highlighted the word feelings here because I know that there's all kinds of debate about, well, maybe you can have unconscious affects and maybe you can have unconscious emotions. So let me be absolutely clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about feelings. I'm talking about the thing that this part of the brain essentially does. It is consciousness-producing tissue. It's tissue that generates affective arousal, and you feel it, as I've just shown you, all the evidence shows. So I'm saying this is not a semantic point when I'm saying you can't have a feeling without feeling it. I mean, of course, it is an oxymoron. Who ever heard of a feeling you don't feel? It's not a feeling if you don't feel it. But it's not just a semantic point. The point is that this is what that part of the brain generates. It generates feeling, and feeling is an intrinsically conscious property. And I'm saying that this part of the brain, the very function of which is switching on the lights of consciousness, switches on feeling at the same time. And so I'm saying feeling is the foundational form of consciousness. And most important of all, I'm saying it is an intrinsically conscious function. Remember, I said at the beginning, this is the problem with studying the cortex. This is the problem with of using perception and visual perception in particular as our model example of a conscious function. These are not intrinsically conscious functions. We were looking in the wrong place, and we thereby went down this rabbit hole of, well, why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark without any inner feel? Well, it does go on in the dark without any inner feel much of the time. It's not a good place to be looking for the fundamental causal mechanisms of consciousness. We should be looking to the reticular activating system. We should be looking to the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray of the brain stem, which generate feeling, which is always conscious, rather than to the cortex, which generates perception and cognition, which is mainly unconscious. Just to be clear about what's at stake here, when I say we went down a rabbit hole, in other words, I'm saying we got all perplexed. Nagel and Jackson and Chalmers got all puzzled about where does why don't our ordinary cognitive mechanistic accounts explain where the consciousness comes from? I'm saying it's because they were looking in the wrong place, and here I will illustrate it by another quotation from Chalmers' famous paper in which he coined the term the hard problem. He says this, it's quite a bold statement. He says, there is no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. So he says, for example, attention. The mechanism of attention, people say, well, look, if you understand the mechanism of attention, then you'll understand, the mechanism of consciousness. And he's saying, but that mechanism doesn't necessarily have to have qualitative feel attached to it. You can have a focusing, sort of highlighting, a foregrounding of some information processing over other information processing. Why does it have to be conscious? Same about the global workspace. It's all very well and good, there are all these different specific little zones doing their processing, and then there's ignition, and then there's a global workspace, and that makes all that information available to all the other bits. And then Chalmers says, yeah, but so what? Why can't this globally available information be globally available unconsciously? Why is the consciousness there? What is the consciousness for? What does the consciousness add? Why doesn't all of this go on without consciousness? And tell me how that information processing produces the consciousness. Go on and show me that. To quote Searles, another philosopher, how does the brain get over the hump from electrochemistry to feeling? Okay, so here's Chalmers. There's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And I'm saying, yep, that's true, because he's looking at cognitive functions. Could he say there is no affective function, such as we can say in advance, that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience? I'm saying he could not say that. The function of feeling, I submit to you that I can say in advance that explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain experience, because the very function of feeling is to feel. You can't give an adequate account of the function of feeling without explaining in advance why does it produce feeling, because that's what it is. And I'm saying that's what this part of the brain that I'm saying we should be looking at, that's what its function is. Its function is to produce feeling. You will not have explained the function of those brainstem structures if you cannot explain feeling, because that's what they do. Unlike the cortex, which doesn't do that. The cortex can do all of that stuff in the dark. This is intrinsically what the function of this part of the brain is. You will not have accounted for it until you've explained why it feels like something. So if Mary were an affective neuroscientist who had, rather than being a blind visual scientist, she was an affective neuroscientist who'd never had a feeling. Let me just say quickly, if she were, she would be in a vegetative state. She would be in a coma. She wouldn't be much of a scientist. But let's just imagine that you can have, because I'm saying you can't. You can't have a conscious creature who doesn't have feeling, because feeling is the prerequisite form of consciousness. But let us give ourselves some latitude here. It's a thought experiment after all. If Mary were an affective neuroscientist and she doesn't have any feelings, but she knows everything there is to know about the causal mechanisms whereby feelings are generated, the equivalent of what I showed you about visual information processing, she had an equivalent level of understanding of how these deep subcortical brain structures generate feeling, what the causal mechanisms are, what the psychophysics of it all are, etc., etc. It would necessarily have to explain why you feel it. She would know in advance that this leads to something that you feel, even if she's never felt it before. She would know it produces something which is subjective, it's something which is valenced, something which matters to the subject of the feeling. Something which has great qualitative distinguishing features in terms of basic arousal states. What she would know about is the function whereby feeling, the functional mechanism whereby feeling is generated. And I'm now going to briefly tell you what that functional mechanism is. It is fundamentally homeostatic. So I'm going to first of all tell you something about how homeostasis works, and then I'll move on to the extended form of homeostasis that is feeling. Homeostasis, as you know, is the most basic biological function. All living things function homeostatically. Homeostasis is what enables us to stay alive, not just you and me, all living things, not only all living animals, all living things, even plants. Living organisms have viable bounds marked here, indicated here by the black line called the set point. It's probably better called a settling point because it's a range. You have to be within this range to remain viable. Unlike all other things in nature, which just obey the second law of thermodynamics and equalize with their environment, lose their organization, just go to pot. We don't. We fight against entropy, and we stay in our preferred states. We don't just equalize in terms of, for example, our temperature. I don't know what it is outside, maybe 10. If I went outside now and I allowed the second law to take effect and I just equalized with the environment and became 10 degrees, I'd be dead. Okay, because it's not viable for a human being to be at 10 degrees Celsius. We have to be between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. That's our settling point. And if we move out of that, then we have a demand for work. We have to do something in order to return ourselves to our viable bounds, and that thing that we do is predicted by our phenotype in the form of reflexes and instincts. That there's certain reflexive responses. I'm moving out of my viable bounds. There's something which what we might call my control center, because that's what we use, the term that we use in homeostasis. There's receptors, effectors, and control centers. The control center predicts when you move out of this temperature range, you do that. So, for example, if you're too hot, you perspire and you pant, and that cools you down. So that work returns you back to your viable bounds. That's how homeostasis works. And it is no small thing, because remember, your very existence depends upon it. Now, where does feeling come into this? I'll use the example that Bjorn used in that same paper that I cited earlier, or that I mentioned earlier, in which he showed this photograph of the girl that I showed you. He used the example of respiratory control. Normally, you are not aware of the fact that, in fact, you have viable bounds in terms of your blood oxygen and carbon dioxide balance. And you have in your hypothalamus little receptors there measuring how much oxygen, how much carbon dioxide, and how do we deal with it? Well, we have a prediction that whenever it's like, need oxygen, breathe in. Got to get rid of carbon dioxide, breathe out. Need oxygen, breathe in. Got to get rid of carbon dioxide, breathe out. Okay, that's the prediction. It's called a reflex. Now, the example that Bjorn gives us is imagine now that you're in an environment which is not expected by the phenotype, by that prediction. That prediction expects a certain amount of ambient oxygen. That's why it works automatically. But what if you're in a carbon dioxide-filled room? What if you're in a burning building? Now, suddenly, when you breathe in, you don't breathe in oxygen. You don't get the expected amount. What happens is it comes to consciousness. A very intense, unpleasant feeling. The demand for work is felt. It's felt in the form of respiratory distress or suffocation alarm. That feeling tells you, I'm moving out of my viable bounds. You don't even have to know that philosophically or biologically. You just know it feels bad. And what do? You randomly move to try and get to somewhere where it doesn't feel like this. But you've never been in a burning building before, let alone this particular one, so you don't know what to do. So you go upstairs randomly. And as you do that, so you find that your suffocation alarm is increasing. And so what do? You change your mind. And you go downstairs instead, and there you find the relief that you were seeking, the pleasurable feeling of, here there's oxygen, here I can breathe. Please note what the feeling did. What the feeling did was it enabled voluntary behavior. It enabled you to choose to go this way or that. It provides the value system. The underlying biological value system is it's good to survive and bad to die, but feeling announces the state of that value system in the forms of valued feelings. Something that feels good is something I prefer and which I seek out. Something which feels bad is something which I disfavor and I avoid. In this way, before it's too late, you are able to change your mind, choice. You're able to change your mind, choice underwrites voluntary behavior, and you're able to do something which enables you to survive in a novel, unexpected environment, in an uncertain environment. That's why I've said here, you don't have a prediction pre-prepared. You're in a state of uncertainty. The feeling guides you by trial and error. Without the feeling, and remember what feeling is. Well, I'm going to say that in a moment. That the feeling enables you to survive. Creatures who do not have this function would not survive. And only those who randomly do the right thing, that small subset of the population who do the right thing because of the random variation in the genome, they will pass on to the next generation when in burning buildings go downstairs. Randomly, this would be the thing that then gets passed on. The rest of the population is wiped out. With us, in our own lifetimes, we don't need to wait to see, am I one of the lucky ones who randomly survived and then I pass this on to my offspring. In our own lifetimes, we can do the right thing on the basis of feeling. That's what feeling does. That's what it causes. This is what it's for. And then in addition to that, we can learn from the experience and we can lay down new predictions. This, by the way, is called the law of effect. One of the most basic laws of learning. It's underwritten by, although the behaviorists didn't believe in feelings, they called them rewards and punishments. But of course, what we mean is pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings. They have these causal consequences. Now, I want to emphasize before I move on that feelings of the kind that I'm talking about, they have arousal. There's a dimension of high or low arousal. There's a continuous variable of valence from negative to positive, unpleasant to pleasant. But there is, in addition to that, a category, a qualitative category, so that feeling hungry feels different from feeling the need to urinate, feels different from feeling suffocation alarm, feels different from feeling sleepy. Each one of them has a qualitative feel. And it's very important that they have this qualitative feel so that you know not just I'm in need, it's which need. So what you're going to do determines which need is currently being prioritized. To put it formally, 8 out of 10 of sleepiness is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst. These are categorical variables. Categorical variables are distinguished qualitatively. So if you say 8 out of 10 of, if they were the same thing and you said 8 out of 10 of sleepiness plus 8 out of 10 of thirst makes 16 out of 20 of total need, so all you need to do is sleep, and then you'll reduce that quantity. If you did that for a sufficiently long period of time, you'll die. It's because you don't just have a continuous variable called need. You have categorical variables. Each need has to be met in its own right. So they must be qualitatively distinguished. They have to be treated as categorical variables. So what I have given you is a mechanistic, natural, scientific account of the function of feeling. Feelings are intrinsically subjective. It's the organism registering its own state, which is intrinsically valenced. In other words, it's intrinsically of value to and for the organism. It's not of value to the universe. It's subjectively valuable. It's existentially valuable to the organism. Intrinsically, it's in the very nature of what we're talking about, that it has to be subjective, that its value is only to and for the organism. And it has to be qualitatively differentiable. It must be. So there I've accounted for, in a very simple, ordinary, natural, scientific way, the causal mechanism of feeling, how feeling comes about, and why. Remember Nagel's question? Why and how is there something it's like to be an organism? Something it's like for the organism? I'm saying, well, that question is easy to answer if you're asking it of affect. If you're asking it of vision, I can see why it's a perplexing question. But I hope you will agree with me, no longer perplexing if you look in the right place. Same with Chalmers's question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner feel? It cannot go on in the dark. Feelings cannot go on without any inner feel. So I'm now going to conclude because I want to remind you that I said at the beginning, I'm not saying cortex does nothing. I'm not saying I'm happy to do away with my cortex. All my consciousness resides in my brainstem. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the seat of consciousness, as it were, the source of consciousness, the hidden spring of the title of that book of mine, of consciousness, is in the brainstem, and then we feel our way into our cognitions, and then something else happens. There are other levels of consciousness that go on up there, and that they are contingent upon the brainstem arousal, is what I'm saying. So let me just quickly whiz through that, and then I'll end. It starts with body monitoring nuclei. Let's use as our model example the hypothalamus. In the medial hypothalamus, there are need detectors. I spoke to you earlier about these osmotic detectors and so on. They're measuring how well or badly are you doing in terms of your homeostatic I was going to say preferences, but they're not preferences, your homeostatic imperatives. How well or badly are you doing in terms of that? All of these different homeostatic mechanisms of the organism, not all of which ever come to consciousness, by the way, because some of them are absolutely predictable, like blood pressure regulation. There's always only two things you can do: change heart rate, change vasodilation. That's always the same. But things like burning buildings and how do I find the oxygen, that's a different matter. So all of these different homeostatic error signals, in other words, the deviation from your setting points, all of this converges upon a single structure, the periaqueductal gray, which, as I said, is directly adjacent to the superior colliculi, so you here have a condensed, and I'm almost directly quoting Bjorn's 2007 paper here. There's a condensed sort of the current state of my needs registered in the PAG, of all my needs, and the current state of the world in the form of the superior colliculi, unconscious as it may be, sort of a salience map of this is where things stand right now, and this is how my needs are right now. That conjunction of needs and opportunities gives rise to a prioritization of which one of these needs is going to be raised to the level of consciousness. What do I mean by raised to the level of consciousness? I mean which one is going to be felt. All the other ones are still regulated autonomically and automatically. I say autonomically and automatically because you've also learned from experience over a lifetime all kinds of habitual ways of dealing with all of your needs, but you can't, there's an action bottleneck. You can't do everything at once. There's also a computational bottleneck. There's the combinatorial explosion. So you focus on the most salient need. This is the one that I have to feel my way through this problem. The others are going to be relegated to automaticity. This one is going to be dealt with by voluntary behavior as I palpate how well or badly am I doing as I move through the world. So the prioritization of a particular need leads to an action program, a policy, a plan. I'm going to do this based, again, on everything that we've learned in the past, and there's an expected outcome. But because this is the one where the greatest uncertainty is, this is why it's prioritized, or the greatest opportunity to resolve uncertainty, this is the one that you feel, and so you palpate how well or badly am I doing in this aspect of my action, the voluntary aspect of my action, the part that's prioritized by being felt. And then you modulate. The modulation of what we call postsynaptic gain, the expected gain. In computational neuroscience, we speak of gain as precision. It's the precision of the signal, or the strength of the signal. It's the degree of confidence that you have in the signal. This error signal, is it noise, or is it an error signal that I need to take account of? So, to use an analogy, if the news tells you the king is dead, no, actually the king isn't dead. Well, the king's really poorly. He might be dead. The palace says the king is dead. No, another source says the king isn't dead. That's a noisy signal. But if you see BBC, king is dead. CNN, king is dead. Another channel, king is dead. Sky News, king is dead. This is a strong signal. This is not noise. This is you have high confidence in that signal. It's called a precise signal. And so the modulation of your confidence in the signal is what the reticular activating system is doing. It's comparing the expected error signal with the actual error signal. And this is the palpating of, and the confidence you have in the error signal is directly proportionate to the confidence you have in your action policy. So as confidence in the error increases, so confidence in your actions policy decreases. And this is the basis upon which we change our minds. And remember, it is all tethered to feeling. Because feeling in the first place tells you this is or isn't working. And then this is transferred. I feel like this about that. And so the very mechanism of voluntary behavior is dictated by feeling. All of this can be reduced to a formalism. One of the papers that Johan Storm put on the screen at the beginning, one of my own papers, is this one that I wrote with alongside Bjorn and Jaak. This is the other chap who has had the greatest influence on my own work. And you can reduce to a formalism just as you can any other form of statistical mechanics, any other form of the palpating of uncertainties in a decision-making process. You can reduce to a formalism how the affect is generated. And for those of you who are not very familiar with this sort of way of speaking, here it is in words. The rate of change of precision, which in that equation is given by omega, the rate of change of precision over time depends on how much free energy changes when you change precision. Free energy is just like basically average error, average surprisal, average difference between the world and the world that you sense as opposed to the world that you expected to sense. This means that precision, in other words, the thing that's modulated by the reticular activating system, will look as if it's trying to minimize free energy, trying to minimize surprise, trying to maximize the match between your model of how things are working as opposed to how they're actually working. The rate of this free energy minimization process is the difference between the variance, that's the inverse precision, and the sum of squared prediction errors. And as I said, precision is negative uncertainty. So I will conclude. This I'm saying to you is an ordinary, natural, scientific, mechanistic account of how feeling arises, what feeling does, how it works, etc. The thing that Chalmers tells us is impossible. When Richard Feynman, this is my last slide I'm about to show you. When Richard Feynman, the great physicist, when Richard Feynman died, he had something written on his blackboard. So it's not quite his last words, but it's something close to his last words. And what was written there was, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So if what I've just given you is on the right track, if it is something in the ballpark of the actual mechanism whereby feeling is generated, then we should be able to engineer an agent which has artificial feelings. We should be able to. There was a famous philosopher, what was his name? Haugeland, I think was his name. He said, computers don't give a damn. If you can engineer an artificial agent that does give a damn, that its very existence, its continued functioning, depends upon it being able to regulate meet its own needs, like look for its own power supply, etc. If you can engineer such an agent using the formalism that I just described to you, or algorithms derived from that, then you would be able to directly test, is this the mechanism whereby feelings arise? And we are, in my laboratory, currently doing this project. We've been working on this for a few years. Of course, there are enormous problems, technical problems, methodological problems, ultimately epistemological problems. Same as with those little kids. How do you know whether there's somebody home? But thankfully, we've got a lot of very clever people helping us all over the world. And so this is where this is all heading. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you for your generosity with the time. I'm sorry I went a little bit over what I had expected to, but I'm glad. Thank you.